Good evening, my warmest friends. It was so good of you to come all this way. You must be dying to begin. It won't be long now. So rest. Rest in peace. I'll be coming for you soon. Oh, very soon. Your time has nearly come. Just a little farther now. Oh, roughly 6 feet or so. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I frighten you? Perhaps that was in bad spirit. Try to stay lively. Your wait is at an end. Make yourself comfortable and take one last look behind you. If knowing what's behind you will make you feel any better. As for me, I like to be surprised. Time to cross over now. So step inside my library and welcome to Ghost Stories for Grown-ups. Welcome back, my friends, to our library, where we specialize in the strange and macabre. And if you're here, perhaps you are a little strange and macabre as well. How delightful. Let's begin with dark news from our archives with Dead Files librarian Mabel. And thanks to the monsters from research who feel the need to increase the so-called fright level, tonight's episode will feature some gratuitous bonus content.
Bonus!
Enjoy.
Hi, I'm Mabel, and this is tonight's news from the Dead Files. Tonight, we're sharing stories of vengeful spirits that have been the instruments for some rough justice, or what I like to think of as revenge best served cold. In 1990, the highest grossing movie around the world was a sleeper hit called Ghost, starring Patrick Swayze, Demi Moore, and Whoopi Goldberg, who would win an Academy Award for her portrayal as reluctant psychic Oda Mae Brown. FYI, this movie is available from the Above Ground Library Yet another shameless plug. But long before Patrick Swayze saved his beloved from beyond the veil, dozens of stories had been published in newspapers telling of lost love seeking ghostly vengeance. Meet Antoinette Georgescu, society wife of wealthy engineer Victor Georgescu. Antoinette was part of a ghostly love triangle so bizarre that in 1931, the Salt Lake Tribune-Sun published her story all the way from Bucharest. When Mr. Georgescu fell ill, Antoinette called a highly regarded doctor to treat what she told friends was something like a mild flu. In comes Dr. Aristide Tănescu, described by the paper as handsome, popular, and single. Oh, blah. During the time Dr. Tănescu treated Victor, he quickly became a friend of the couple and frequented their home even after Victor began to recover. Raise your hand if you know where this is going. Everything seemed grand until Victor took a sudden turn for the worse and died. Friends and family were shocked since it seemed that Victor had beaten his ailment. Again, I have a bad feeling I know where this is going. The grieving widow buried her husband, then flew to Paris the next day to convalesce. Shortly after that, Dr. Tănescu also flew to Paris to tend to the widow. Everything seemed above board, but Dr. Tănescu's attention wasn't exactly part of his Hippocratic oath, and after a while it seemed obvious what the good doctor was really after. Called it! Antoinette didn't spur the attention, and the two were seen together publicly on many occasions. But letters written by Antoinette to her mother revealed she became bored with the romance when she began to miss Victor. This is about when Dr. Tănescu's letters home turned foreboding and talked about the ghost of Victor thwarting his romantic endeavors with Antoinette. In one letter he states, "We can't get rid of it. Certainly not this side of the grave." Dr. Tănescu decided then to take the fight to Victor when he shot and killed Antoinette and then turned the gun on himself. The apparent murder-suicide raised eyebrows, and Victor Georgescu's body was exhumed for a proper autopsy. Turns out, Victor died of a lethal morphine overdose, likely administered by Dr. Tănescu. Whether or not Antoinette knew of the murder or is possibly complicit, well, she took that truth to the grave. According to a 2008 Psychology Today article, millions of people had reported encounters with dead family members and labeled those encounters as exceptional experiences, explained as hallucinations or tricks of the mind due to grief or guilt. Perhaps that would explain stories of people like Mr. Mendes Grace, whose wife committed suicide after he left her for another woman. He was so tormented by seeing the ghost of his dead wife. A year later, in 1908, he ended his own life by ingesting strychnine just to be rid of her. Or this 1904 article about miner Andrew Green, who remarried just 1 month after his wife died. His dead spouse was so angry that her ghost not only visited, but she also beat him with a club. Hell hath no fury like a ticked-off, angry ghost woman. But what about explaining occurrences that happen long after death? Like this story out of Toledo, Ohio, recounting the final day of 60-year-old Thomas Geoghegan. This one's my favorite. In April 1901, Thomas Geoghegan stepped out in front of an electric car and was killed despite all his best efforts to stay alive, including leaving work early to avoid traffic. Thomas was spooked because the day before, the dead wife he referred to as Evil One came a-calling. By the time Thomas arrived at work, the ghost of his wife had already been haunting him 10 to 12 hours, and by afternoon, Thomas cried to his friend, "I'm doomed. She is after me, and I can't get away from her. I can see her this very moment, and she's demanding her revenge." Eesh. Turns out, Thomas had spent 8 years in prison for killing his wife during an altercation, and perhaps she waited a long time to return the favor. Thomas's final day was full of mishaps, like falling off his chair and other office oopses. But then, while driving his coal wagon, he was struck by a streetcar and barely escaped with his life. He then fell down a 20-foot embankment, where he was struck again by another streetcar, but with non-life-threatening injury. The article then states that he quit work deliberately under the belief that if he continued, he would be killed in some manner before the day was over. He hastened to put himself out of harm's way and remained indoors until all traffic had ceased and he thought the danger period passed. When he ventured forth across the street to go to bed in the office, a car that had never been known to run at that hour consummated the doom which Geegan felt was in store. Like I said, folks, best served cold. Bonus! That's all for now. Stay tuned until next episode for another tale from the Dead Files, where truth is stranger than fiction. Speaking of revenge, I've got some silly string with Ghoul's name on it.
Hey!
Thank you, Mabel, for dishing out those wonderful...
Bonus!
Thank you, Mabel. Now, please welcome tonight's guest, Amanda Warner, who will be reading a selection written by Alice Hoffman entitled The Other Woman, from the book Echoes. From the book Echoes, the saga anthology of ghost stories, edited by Ellen Datlow and published by Saga Press. Enjoy this uninterrupted presentation.
She came to me on the 1st of May, on the anniversary of the occurrence. This often happens. People have strong regrets at such times. They are reminded by the weather or by a tree in bloom. We live in the same town, although I'm in the outskirts near the cemetery. Everyone knows where. They know what I do. There were flowering azaleas on my lawn, so perhaps she didn't notice the brambles or the weeds. I was at the window when she pulled up. I was there before my dog began to bark. Frankly, I'd been expecting her. I was surprised it had taken a full year for her to come to me, but people have their own timetables. She wore a blue spring coat and a plaid dress and black pumps. Her hair was dark and plain, and I could tell she had been crying, even though she was wearing sunglasses. Her face was puffy. I didn't listen to gossip, but in a town as small as ours, it would have been impossible not to know. Plus, it was in the newspaper. Not just the Monitor, but the Boston Globe as well. It was an event. A personal catastrophe, the kind people talk about long after it's over. When I invited her in, she hesitated. I could tell she didn't completely believe in what I did, and had come here as a last attempt, even if she didn't trust me. Her friends had likely pulled her aside and suggested she call me. It was a town full of old houses, and old houses had past lives. Occasionally, those lives continued, even when the new occupants wanted them gone. They had to be helped along. I learned the cleansing method from my grandmother when I was a child. I went house to house with her until I was 10, when my mother put a stop to it. Still, I remembered. It's not something you forget. I'd made tea to ease the conversation, which can be difficult at the beginning, but she didn't touch hers. I understood why. Her hands were shaking. She was rattled, I could see that. But then I'd seen it before. People driven to the brink by something they couldn't quite see or believe, and yet it was ruining their lives. She said she had tried everything to rid herself of the ghost. Sage, salt, holy water, closed windows, white candles. What could I do for her that she hadn't already done herself? My method was Russian, I explained, and involved catching the unwelcome spirit in a jar. I couldn't tell her more. It was a family secret. But I led her to my pantry to show her what I kept on the shelves. I had 30 jars filled with light. Some were blue, others green. One looked like a splotch of ink. "What do you do with them?" she asked. She had a little girl's voice, which was disconcerting considering what she'd done. "That's my business," I said. Surely her friends had told her I was prickly and had a mind of my own. She wrote me a check for $1,000. I knew she had married into money, which is the reason I raised my usual price. Truthfully, I tend not to charge at all, especially in desperate situations. After she handed over the check, I felt a draft of cold air. Then I saw something on the floor that interested me. There, beside my client's purse, was a photograph of the apple tree where the woman in question had hanged herself. My client seemed quite oblivious. That's when I knew I was hearing both sides of the story. I went out on Sunday, the day her husband played golf. She didn't want him to know, which I understood. She was the sort of woman who always acted as if everything was in place, even when it wasn't. I could tell that from her shoes. Highly polished, new heels, as if she hadn't a care in the world. I parked on the street, carrying my grandmother's bag. The jars I'd brought clanked against each other, sounding like bells. I stopped to observe the tree where it had happened. It was in bloom, white as a cloud. I had read that the previous tenant had dragged the ladder from the garage in order to climb up. When I walked up the driveway, white flowers floated down. My client was waiting for me on the porch, wearing a sweater even though the day was fine. Ghosts do that. They drop the temperature, and when I walked inside, I felt the chill in the air. All the furniture was different now, my client told me. They'd donated everything that had been here before. They'd even changed the yard, pulling up the old brick patio and replacing it with stone. I said I had to walk through the house on my own to see what the rooms revealed. She nodded and said, of course, but she looked nervous. She blurted out that she hadn't wanted to live here, but her husband had said it wouldn't be cost-effective to move. No one wanted to buy a house where someone had hung herself. Now they were stuck. When I set my bag down, I noticed that the knives were set out in a row on the countertop. She did that this morning, my client said. She does it every day. I started with the living room. It had been painted red, which some people believe is a cure for haunting, though I've never found it to be true. I noticed a book open on the coffee table, a book of poems written by Ralph Waldo Emerson, who had lived less than a mile away. Give all to love, obey your heart. My client had been the previous occupant's friend. After her husband walked out, my client had spent night after night comforting her dear friend before the truth came out. It was a love letter that gave it away, kept in his drawer. Some people don't understand the power of the written word. It surfaces when you least expect it to. As I crossed the room, I saw marks on the curtains, like the claw marks of a cat, though none was in residence. I could see the tree from this window, right in the middle of the lawn. I took the stairs. I'd been told that the runner had been replaced, but there were the previous tenant's wet footsteps, as if she had just come in from walking in the wet grass. The tub in the upstairs bathroom was full. My client had told me she had to drain it every morning. I went to the bedroom and stood on the threshold. It was very cold here. There was ice on the ceiling and on the walls. My grandmother once told me, "We are not the only ones who have regrets, whose hands shake, who weep over our mistakes. Ghosts have regrets too. They wish they'd stayed home on the morning of their death, that they hadn't married the wrong man, that they'd left the ladder in the garage and packed a suitcase instead. They wish they'd said goodbye to love and hello to the bright, brilliant world." It was quiet inside the bedroom. All of the dresser drawers had been pulled open. I'd been told they refused to stay closed. I had my bag with me, which I set down. Then I lay upon the bed. This is the reason I can't have clients follow me around. To get to the heart of the matter, I have to do things that can seem strange, even inappropriate. I got under the blanket. I could tell that the right side had been her side. My client said her perfume was on the pillow, no matter how often the linens were changed. Through the window, I could see a wedge of blue sky and the top boughs of the apple tree. That was when I started to cry. I felt overwhelmed by emotion, even though I'm usually very clear-headed. I'd seen it happen to my grandmother a few times. She'd have to sit down and I'd bring her a drink of cold water. It would take her a while to collect herself, but she finally would. I went downstairs and informed my client I'd have to tear up her check. I couldn't help her. "Then we're selling the house," she said. "I don't care if we take a loss." She didn't bother to see me out, and there was no need to say goodbye. We hardly knew each other after all. I went down the driveway and gazed up at the falling white petals. It was a pretty property, and sooner or later someone would buy it. They'd likely get a good price. Not that it would do my ex-client any good. People who think ghosts can't travel are mistaken. They stay close to whatever and whomever matters most, a place or a person. They can walk for miles, fit in the trunk of your car, fold themselves into a suitcase. I kept that information to myself, however. She'd find out soon enough.
Wasn't that delicious? And good news, we have a new opening in market research. Qualified monsters are encouraged to apply. Now, let's continue with our very own library ghoul who was inspired to pen this original work.
Tips to avoid being haunted by your spouse. Wait for it. Don't kill them. Dramatic pause. Now, it should go without saying that if you can't do the time, then don't be a tool and don't do the crime. But for those who are listening whose intellectual fire has been doused, here's some tips to avoid being haunted by your spouse. Don't stab them, don't shoot them, don't choke them out cold. Don't drown them or hang them, or hauntings be foretold. Don't hammer them, don't burn them, don't push them downstairs. Don't dress them in meat shirts and surround them with bears. Don't tie them to railroads or put bags on their head. Don't poison their coffee. They'll come for you when they're dead. Don't cut their brake lines, an act of sheer folly. Don't distract them while walking. They'll get struck by a trolley. Don't harass them or mistreat them or run them down in your car. Don't tie blocks to their feet and drop them in tar. Don't hit them with shovels or close their hands in the door. Don't take all their shoes and leave broken glass on the floor. Don't be an idiot. Don't take them for granted. You could be the one that ends up getting planted. Don't dare them to do something so incredibly stupid, for if they follow through, lives can be concluded. Well, obviously I've given this thought, and to you that sounds funny. But I became a ghoul somehow. Oh, and I still love you, honey.
Oh, ghoul dear, always the romantic, and a perfectly sweet way to end our evening. It's time to say goodbye for now, but only until next time. But until next time, remember, be nice to spiders. Have tea with the ghost in your attic. And don't forget to feed the unemployed monster under your bed. Good night.